You can think about that. While you're thinking, I would like to raise an extensive question first. We know that now the ultra-high rises start from 100, 200 meters to 1 kilometer high now. During this process, from the architect perspective, how are you looking at this trend? What is the greatest challenge? Or from the design perspective, what should we pay more attention to? Can you briefly answer these questions? Let's start from Mr. Zhang. I think in the current technology condition, people's desire, developers' desire, it can be accomplished. Architects' talent is also offering great potential. In these years' communication, we've found that now the design is totally liberalized. We have sufficient methods to help us to build such high buildings, and we want to be higher and higher, and the scale is bigger and bigger. But I think actually the greatest challenge is that under such circumstances, comfort of the people, environmental pollution, protection, energy saving, these are the problems. How can we balance our desire with these challenges? Including, we should also consider the commercial value, how to balance all these factors. So as developers, as designers, as planners, I think this is our greatest challenge, especially in those places with clusters of ultra-high rises. The size of those buildings pose great challenge for energies, etc. This is our greatest challenge. So, for the other speakers?
Completely when the question was asked, so I'm going to maybe answer a question that wasn't asked. One of the things I think is quite interesting in this whole thing that we talked about today is, as a structural engineer, I look back, go back, say, 30 years ago, architecture was much simpler because, quite frankly, that's all the structural engineer could calculate. There was a very great deal of limitation on what was the design could be done because that's all we could calculate, that's all we could produce. Well, one of the things that this presentation certainly brings forward to me is we're now in a new era, and we haven't really noticed it. We haven't really spoke about the fact that this governor, this restraint on our capabilities has been removed. And we really haven't had a critical discussion about that as the profession about there's so much that we can do, and there's been a lot of architecture that I call my irrational exuberance that is in the last few years, and I think we should just talk about when is it appropriate and when is it not. Certainly we don't want every building to be a box, but then we also should have more discussion about just because we can doesn't mean we should. So I don't have no idea what the question was, but that's the answer.
I like your answer. And in a way, I would like to add to continue the streak of misunderstanding in what we're talking about. I would like to add that I think it's actually it's maybe interesting to look at this historically in parallel to a big time back. When there was a shift through the industrialization and suddenly a shift in the possibilities of what could be built. Modernization was the great project of redefining architecture at the time. It had a few incredibly positive and social ambitions, but it also was maybe partly blinded by the possibilities that were there of mass production, of repetition. And while it was partly connected to a social project, it also partly failed because in the end it might not have fully accounted for what its own intention was, which was the great social project. And I think maybe if we think about today in a slightly similar way, we are clearly at the point where possibilities exponentially explode or implode, we will see. And where these possibilities lead us to so far unseen places. And I think the big question is, where are we going with this? And is it really necessary to go there? When architecture was small, it was automatically connected to a lot of things. It was connected to the people that built it, that inhabited it, to the city or village that surrounded it. And as the things we do get bigger and bigger, for me the question is really pertinent to ask, how do we avoid a greater and greater inertness of what we're doing, a greater and greater self-sufficiency? It sounds so cool, self-sufficient. We need nobody else anymore. But maybe it's a disaster if we don't need anybody else anymore. Maybe we do need to think about how we live together and what the social structure of a society ultimately is and how things contribute to that. And in that precise sense or thought, I would also like to suggest to really think about sustainability not only as a matter of ecology and environment, but also of social issues and how we live together. We certainly have to protect our planet, but we simultaneously have to protect the human beings with it. And I think that remains the greatest challenge for all of us and has maybe always been.
Thank you. So any questions from the floor? Okay, here is a question.
To continue the thread about the social sustainability, I know we all know that the urbanization is ascending rapidly, but all the examples we've seen today, they almost operate in another realm. You know, there's an image by Oli, which is two old elderly gentlemen against the backdrop of the CCTV. I think the kind of reality we are surrounded by all of it. Sometimes we also appear helpless in looking at cities. For example, I was in Mumbai and just Shanghai. Mumbai is like more than 50% covered in slums. So when I'm looking at all this glass and steel towers and coming up, I'm also at the same time thinking about what happens with all these people, you know, migrating from the rural region into the city. How are we operating in this kind of the two poles, you know? So maybe I'd like to hear some thoughts from the speakers about, you know, operating in this glass and steel sort of environment and versus architecture as a sort of heroic instrument for social sustainability, perhaps.
The silence speaks for itself, probably. Yeah, so I think obviously I'll just dare to be first, but I think our problem obviously is that we, this is a room full of elitists, all of us, yeah? We are working at an extreme segment of this world where it's taller, better, more expensive, more extremely engineered, more ambitiously sculpted. And that is in parts the problem. And ironically, once you are there, it becomes also increasingly difficult to get away from it, because if today I go to a client and say, I would like to do social housing, then they're all laughing and say like, oh, you know, we don't need architects for that. And I think this is exactly where the trouble starts, that there is a misassumption that architecture at this point is indeed at the service of the best and the most iconic instead of the other project. And I think the way that our economy is driving things and the way that our system, our economic system is driving things, it exactly exacerbates and generates this thrust and tendency. And it's a difficult proposition, but maybe this is in the end what we have to think about to really answer your question.
Maybe I'll add something. And I didn't understand the first question either, but you know, I think that many of us view ourselves oftentimes as technicians, designers that deal with how to make things. And I do believe that, you know, we are at the service of society, and to advance the art and science of making things. But ultimately, we, in that service of creating environments, that we oftentimes have to speak up, to talk to our clients, to get involved in politics, to do the social housing or the nonprofit developments, or to provide answers and ideas for those that can't afford it or aren't able to. And there's many practices that try to do that. Many in this room have not only tall buildings, which is what we're talking about here today, but also think about how tall buildings are part of the elements of a city. And cities are the places where they generate the most opportunity for the widest spectrum of society. So absolutely, you know, in terms of cities that need help and could stand to have a better quality of life, that's what we're all interested in. So I'm sure that each one of our practices, you know, has tall buildings, but also has housing that is for people that deserve it at any income level and social level. It has schools, it has healthcare, it has places that provide for a social mission. And I would say part of each of us, our values and culture then defines who we are. And we think that there's a right thing to do, get out and vote and put people in power that believe in the same things.
Thank you very much.
Right. Two questions, one generic and one specific. The first question, apparently you presented really great projects, wide variety of beautiful, iconic. But do we have any insightful feedback from the actual users, whether that success or failure, so that we can learn from, in addition to seeing all of these, you know, beautiful buildings? That's the generic. The specific and technical, how does these complex shapes relate to maintenance as the building after being built? Is there any like really additional cost for making this very difficult job on maintaining the facades, for example? And thank you in advance. Anyone?
I'm trying to remember the question. In terms of building technology, you know, I do think that somebody had asked what, I think it was in the introductory session, you know, what is one of the most important things that buildings could do, particularly tall buildings can do. And I do think that there is great advances that need to be made, can be made in terms of materials technology, so that buildings could be more sophisticated and they could catch up to science. We oftentimes are still building things as if it was in, you know, 100 years ago. Less so about structures and engineering, but maybe structural engineering, but certainly concrete and steel technology is going to get better. And I mean, has already gotten better, and they're being tested and used to a great extent by the engineers. But I think there's things such as energy, MEP systems, have a long ways to go in terms of using less energy, providing more comfort. Glass, you know, everybody tries to do an all-glass building, yet you always try to cover it up because of heat gain. So there's something about that needs to be developed and could be really tied into some of the advances that are being developed in research right now. And it does apply to your question, I think, about maintenance and how these buildings last. And we do think that in our practice that the tests of a building, the really kind of understanding of whether a building is a quality building or not, has to do with how it is made and the craftsmanship and the ability to stand the test of time. And that includes not only just the way it looks, but also in how it's maintained, but also how do users ultimately live and work and play in these buildings, and what kind of feedback they give us in terms of whether or not those buildings are repeatable or they are expendable.
Please With me, give for the presenters a big round of applause, and we are going to present them with souvenirs.